stand on any tidal creek bank in South Carolina's low country at low tide. The pluff mud stretches out in every direction. The water is the color of weak tea, carrying a haze of suspended silt that hasn't settled in years. The marsh edge crumbles where it meets the water, not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow, steady retreat. Fish that once swarmed these shallows are harder to find. The birds that followed the fish are quieter, and if you know what you're looking at, you can see the shape of something missing. That missing thing is an oyster reef. And what's happening along South Carolina's coast is what happens everywhere those reefs disappear. South Carolina boasts more salt marsh than any other state on the East Coast. That's not a small distinction. These are some of the most biologically productive ecosystems on the planet, teeming with juvenile fish, nesting birds, and the kind of invisible chemical cycling that keeps entire food webs functioning. But South Carolina's coastline and salt marshes are disappearing at an alarming rate due to sea level rise and erosion. 2/3 of South Carolina's more than 8,600-mile-long marsh and beach shoreline is eroding, fraying at the edges under the pressure of rising seas and a century of habitat loss. Coastlines are losing wildlife habitat and nursery grounds for commercially important fisheries such as shrimp and blue crab. So what happened? And more importantly, what happens when you put one small piece back? Here's the thing about oysters that most people don't appreciate. They aren't just seafood. They are infrastructure. They are the load-bearing wall of an entire coastal ecosystem. Oysters act as a foundation species by creating habitat and enhancing multiple ecosystem functions. Remove them, and the structure doesn't hold. Add them back, and something extraordinary begins to unfold, a chain reaction of recovery that scientists are only now fully mapping. Oyster reefs are now one of the most endangered habitats in the world, having suffered an estimated 85% global loss over the past century. Along the east coast of North America, the eastern oyster, known scientifically as Crassostrea virginica, was once so plentiful that in some places reefs were so big that ships had to navigate around them. Since then, in many areas, the populations have dwindled to just a few percent of what they once were. This is due to disease, overharvesting, habitat loss, and poor water quality. The consequences aren't just ecological, they're physical. Think of a healthy oyster reef as a natural seawall. Its jagged, complex surface breaks incoming wave energy before it can tear into the soft marshbank behind it. Without that buffer, every tide is an erosion event. The bank collapses, the marsh retreats, the mudflat widens. The water gets murkier because there's nothing left to filter it. And once the water gets murky, the seagrass that depends on sunlight dies back, which means the juvenile fish that shelter in that seagrass lose their nursery. It's a cascade. One removal triggers the next. Research across 13 major U.S. estuaries found that the filtration capacity of oysters has declined almost universally, by a median of 85%. That number is almost incomprehensible when you understand what oyster filtration actually means at scale. A single oyster can filter 180 liters of water every day. A healthy reef isn't one oyster, it's millions of them, stacked and clustered into a living, breathing water treatment system that runs around the clock for free, powered entirely by tidal flow. And South Carolina, to its credit, decided to rebuild it. The South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program, known as SCORE, is a community-based habitat restoration and monitoring program of the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. It operates under the direction of the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and began in May 2001. The concept is almost deceptively simple. Oyster larvae, called spat, need a hard surface to settle on. Without shell to land on, they sink into the mud and die. When no suitable substrate exists, the oyster dies. So, SCORE's core strategy is shell recycling, collecting discarded oyster shells from restaurants, roasts, and individual households, and putting them back into the Low Country's waterways instead. Volunteers fill polypropylene mesh bags with shell and plant them fire brigade style along shorelines to provide a clean, hard substrate for oyster larvae to settle on. The scale of what ordinary people have built here is staggering. The SCORE program has worked with more than 700 organizations statewide, recycled over 609,000 bushels of shell, and constructed 34 miles of living shoreline, helping restore and protect critical estuarine habitat. Since 2010, South Carolina has recycled more than 500,000 bushels of shell, more than the leading nonprofit programs in the Chesapeake Bay and New York Harbor. The sites span 200 miles of coastline from Murrells Inlet to Hilton Head, South Carolina. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the restoration teams weren't just trying to grow oysters. They were trying to restart a domino effect. Domino 1, the reef structure returns. Rocks, old shells, wrecks, and piers accumulate oysters that grow together, shell upon shell. As the reef takes shape, it becomes an excellent shelter for other sea life. The three-dimensional architecture of a reef, all those crevices, overhangs, and hard surfaces, creates microhabitats that flat, featureless mud simply cannot. Oyster reefs create important habitat for hundreds of species. Organisms like mussels, barnacles, and sea anemones settle on them, creating abundant food sources for commercially valuable fish. Domino 2, the water clears. As the oyster population builds, filtration begins in earnest. Oysters reduce water turbidity by removing particles from the water column, assimilating organic matter, and releasing nutrient-rich biodeposits into the sediment, benefiting neighboring seagrass, which are themselves extremely significant ecosystems. Clearer water means light reaches the bottom again, and where light reaches the bottom, seagrass grows back, and where seagrass grows back, the next domino falls. Domino 3, the fish nurseries reopen. Oyster reefs create niche space and provide nursery habitat for fishes and invertebrates, serving comparable functions as tropical coral reefs. Picture a stretch of restored reef in a South Carolina tidal creek. At first there's nothing. Then the invertebrates arrive, small crabs, worms, tiny crustaceans colonizing the spaces between shells. Then the juvenile fish find them. Flounder, red drum, spotted sea trout, the species that define the Low Country's fisheries and its fishing culture, begin using the reef as a feeding ground and refuge. Higher abundance of transient finfish and mobile macroinvertebrates at reef sites suggests that faunal communities were attracted by the higher abundance of prey resources, polychaetes, small crustaceans, juvenile gastropods, and bivalves, as supported by the reefs. The reef areas served as shelter, nursery, and foraging grounds for different species. Domino 4, the sediment stabilizes. By reinstating oyster populations and their hard substrata, restored reefs can attenuate wave energy, trap sediments, and foster adjacent salt marsh expansion. This is the one that surprises people most. It's not just that the reef slows erosion at the bank, it's that the reef actively builds land. Through filter feeding, oysters deposit sediment, which builds surrounding land. By breaking the impact of waves, oysters allow the inland growth of seagrasses, marsh grasses, and other less wave-tolerant species. SCORE's own monitoring confirms this. Marsh grass is filling in behind many SCORE reefs, a visible, measurable sign that the land itself is healing. Domino 5. The birds come back. And this is the one that tells you, more than any monitoring station or data set, that something real has changed. Shorebirds, oyster catchers, egrets, herons, willets are specialists. They depend on specific food in specific places. When those places disappear, the birds disappear with them. But restored reefs bring the invertebrates. The invertebrates bring the fish and the shellfish bring the birds. By a few years after reef restoration projects are established, oysters on the reef are large enough to harvest, and oyster catchers return to forage on the structure. That's the cascade completing itself, from a bag of recycled shells on a mudflat to a hunting oyster catcher, loud and orange-billed against a low-country sky. Oyster reefs provide a number of important ecosystem services, including storm surge abatement, water filtration, sequestration of nutrients, stabilization of sediments, and creation of nursery habitat for fishes and invertebrates. Scientists have also discovered something even more surprising. Oyster reefs drive microbial processes such as denitrification, converting excess nitrogen into inert gases and thus mitigating eutrophication, the runaway algae blooms that suffocate coastal waters and create dead zones. The reef is, in other words, also a water quality laboratory operating at ecosystem scale. None of this recovery is instant. Species diversity and composition on restored reefs shifted toward states similar to live reefs within 12 months of restoration, while recovery of species abundance occurred within 18 months of restoration. That's fast, by ecological standards, but it requires the reef to survive long enough to reach that threshold. It requires the right substrate, the right tidal zone, the right water conditions. Reefs constructed in partnership with SCORE since 2020 support approximately 2,678,000 oysters and protect 625 linear feet of shoreline in the Charleston Harbor, Murrells Inlet, and Beaufort. What South Carolina is doing matters beyond its own borders because it's demonstrating something that coastal managers around the world are watching closely. That restoration of a single keystone species can reverse a cascade of losses that seemed permanent. The coastline doesn't have to keep retreating. The water doesn't have to stay murky. The fish nurseries don't have to stay empty. One species, strategically returned, can pull an entire ecosystem back from the edge. Restoration scientists hope that more coastal residents and visitors will learn to see oysters in a broader way, not only as food, but as keystone species in healthy estuaries and salt marsh ecosystems. That shift in perception is part of the work, because the SCORE program runs on volunteers. SCORE works with over 4,000 volunteers every year in a variety of ways to help with these endeavors. These are people who show up at low tide, wade into pluff mud, and pass bags of oyster shell hand to hand down a shoreline, not because they're scientists, but because they live here and they can see what's been lost, and they want to be part of what comes back. The science is clear. The chain reaction is real. The dominoes are falling in the right direction for once, and it all starts with something you could hold in your hand. A single shell, rough-edged and gray, dropped back into the water where it belongs. If this story moved you, share it with someone who lives near a coast. And if you want to see more videos about the science of ecological recovery, the hidden systems that hold our world together, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.